Picture this. September 1945. The war has just ended. For years, Japanese women have been told that the Allied soldiers are monsters, faceless demons who will destroy everything they hold sacred. They've never seen a photograph, never heard their voices except through filtered propaganda. The enemy exists only as a nightmare painted by their government. But today, that's about to change forever. Today, for the first time, they will see the face of the one they've been taught to fear more than death itself. And what happens next will shatter everything they believed about war, humanity, and the nature of evil. Before we dive into this profound moment in history, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had a moment that completely changed how you saw the world. This isn't just another war story. This is about the moment an entire nation's carefully constructed reality collapsed in absolute silence. This is about women who stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to process what their eyes were showing them. This is about the day Japan discovered that the greatest lie of war isn't about strategy or territory. It's about the enemy's face. And this story begins not with the soldiers' arrival, but with the architecture of fear that made that moment so devastating. For nearly 15 years, the Japanese Empire had perfected the art of dehumanization. Through radio broadcasts that crackled through every home, through propaganda posters plastered on every street corner, through mandatory assemblies where children were taught to recite the characteristics of the foreign devils, the government had created an enemy that existed only in nightmares. The British were described as barbaric colonizers who ravaged Asia with no mercy. The Americans were portrayed as culturally bankrupt savages who valued nothing but violence and materialism. Soviet soldiers were painted as subhuman beasts. But here's what made this propaganda so uniquely devastating. The Japanese people had no counter-narrative. Unlike in Europe, where borders were porous and cultural exchange was constant, Japan's island isolation and strict censorship meant that for most Japanese citizens, these descriptions were the only truth they knew. Women raised their children with these fears embedded in their lullabies. Mothers told daughters that capture by Allied forces meant fates worse than death. Schools taught that sacrifice, even suicide, was preferable to facing the enemy. The propaganda wasn't just believed, it was internalized as absolute reality, woven into the very fabric of daily life and national identity. Among these women was our protagonist, though she didn't know she would become one. Her name was Hiroko Nakamura, a 32-year-old schoolteacher from Yokohama who had lost her husband to the war 2 years earlier. Hiroko represented something profound in Japanese society. She was educated, thoughtful, and had once questioned the propaganda in the privacy of her own mind. Before the war intensified, she had read translated Western literature, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, smuggled copies that her late father, a university professor, had collected before such books were banned. These stories had planted seeds of doubt in her mind. How could the people who wrote with such humanity about love, loss, and moral struggle be the monsters described in the daily broadcasts? But Hiroko had learned to silence these questions. In wartime Japan, doubt was treason, and she had a 7-year-old daughter to protect. So she taught her students what the curriculum demanded, repeated the slogans when required, and buried her questions deep beneath layers of survival and conformity. She had become an expert at appearing absolutely certain while being internally conflicted, a skill that would make her the perfect witness to what was about to unfold. On the morning of August 30th, 1945, just 2 weeks after Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio address, announcing Japan's surrender, Hiroko stood in the kitchen of her small wooden house, her hands trembling as she prepared miso soup. The neighborhood had been buzzing with terrified whispers for days. The Allied occupation forces were coming to Yokohama today. The instructions from local authorities had been clear but contradictory. Remain indoors, show no hostility, display white cloth as a sign of peace, but also protect yourselves, hide your daughters, prepare for the worst. The cognitive dissonance was maddening. Hiroko's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Tanaka, had spent the previous night teaching her teenage granddaughters how to use kitchen knives for self-defense. Another family had sent their young women to relatives in the mountains. The fear was so thick you could taste it, a metallic, suffocating presence that made every breath feel dangerous. Hiroko had made her decision. She would stay, she would observe, and she would face whatever came with the dignity her father had always embodied. But she had also hidden her daughter at her sister's house 30 kilometers away. Some risks were too great, regardless of one's philosophical courage. The first sounds came just after noon. a low rumble that gradually grew into the unmistakable thunder of military trucks. Hiroko moved to her window, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. Through the gaps in her wooden fence, she could see her neighbors doing the same. Faces pressed against windows, eyes peering through cracks, bodies frozen in postures of primal vigilance. The convoy appeared at the end of the street, and Hiroko's first thought was how ordinary it looked. She had expected darkness, chaos, vehicles bristling with weapons pointed at civilian homes. Instead, she saw standard military trucks moving at a careful, almost respectful speed, as if the drivers were conscious of not frightening the population further. Then the trucks stopped, doors opened, and the soldiers stepped out. The silence that followed was unlike anything Hiroko had ever experienced. It wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was the presence of collective shock so profound that it suppressed even the involuntary noises of human existence. No one coughed. No one shifted their weight. No one seemed to breathe. Because what the women of Yokohama saw defied everything they had been conditioned to expect. The soldiers were young. Most looked barely out of their teenage years, with faces that bore the exhaustion of men who had seen too much too soon. They were tall, yes, and their uniforms were foreign, but their body language spoke of uncertainty rather than aggression. Some lit cigarettes with hands that shook slightly. Others looked around with expressions that seemed almost apologetic, as if they too were unsure of how to navigate this fraught moment. One soldier, blonde with sunburned cheeks, caught Hiroko's eye through her fence, and instead of the predatory gaze she expected, she saw something that nearly broke her. He looked scared. This young man, armed and backed by the most powerful military force on earth, looked terrified of the silent Japanese women watching him from behind their barriers. But the most devastating detail came when one of the British soldiers reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small photograph. He showed it to his companion. Hiroko couldn't hear their words, but she could see the photograph clearly enough. It showed a woman, perhaps his wife or sister, holding a small child. The soldier smiled as he pointed to it, that universal expression of a man missing his family. And in that instant, something inside Hiroko fractured. This was the enemy. This homesick boy who carried photographs of loved ones and smiled with such unguarded tenderness. The dissonance between what she was seeing and what she had been taught was so extreme that her mind struggled to process it. She felt dizzy, nauseous, as if the ground itself had become unstable. Around her she could sense the same shock rippling through the neighborhood. Women who had emerged from their homes were now frozen in postures of confusion, their prepared defenses rendered irrelevant by the simple humanity on display before them. Then came the antagonists. Not the soldiers, but the voices that would desperately try to maintain the old narrative. Mrs. Yamamoto, a fierce nationalist whose son had died at Guadalcanal, emerged from her house with fury written across her weathered face. "Don't be fooled!" she shouted in Japanese, her voice cracking with grief and rage. "This is a trick. They smile while they prepare to destroy us. Have you forgotten what they are? What they did to our empire? To our sons?" Her words should have rallied the neighborhood, but instead they fell flat, sounding increasingly hollow against the visual evidence before them. Still, Mrs. Yamamoto persisted, her anger growing more desperate. "You're traitors, all of you, standing here like fools, letting their faces confuse you. They're demons. The radio told us. The posters showed us." She pointed at the soldiers with a trembling finger. "Look at them with clear eyes. See what they truly are." But Hiroko had learned something profound in that moment of paralysis. Sometimes seeing with clear eyes means acknowledging that what you were told and what is real are completely different. She found herself stepping forward, not with aggression but with a quiet resolve that surprised even herself. "Mrs. Yamamoto," she said softly, her teacher's voice carrying calm authority. "I am looking with clear eyes, and I'm asking myself, if they are demons, why do they carry photographs of their families? If they are monsters, why do they look as frightened as we feel? If they are savages, why are they moving with such evident caution to avoid frightening us further?" The confrontation that followed would become legendary in that neighborhood. Mrs. Yamamoto turned her fury on Hiroko. "Your husband died for the empire. How dare you dishonor his memory by showing sympathy to his killers?" The words were designed to wound, to shame, to silence. But Hiroko had spent too many nights alone with her grief to let it be weaponized. "My husband died believing he was protecting me from monsters," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears now streaming down her face. But what I see before me are not monsters. They are men. Young, scared men who probably had no more choice about being here than my husband had about dying in the Pacific. And I think he would want me to see the truth, even if the truth is complicated, even if it means everything we were told was a lie. The tension was suffocating. Other neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the raised voices, creating a small crowd suspended between the old propaganda and the new reality. The British soldiers, sensing something significant was happening even if they couldn't understand the words, stood motionless, waiting. One of them, an older officer with kind eyes, made a subtle gesture to his men, a hand signal that clearly meant, stay calm, don't react, give them space. It was such a small moment of respect, of understanding, yet it spoke volumes. He recognized that these Japanese women were fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with military conflict, and everything to do with the collision of truth and indoctrination. Then came the moment that would transform everything. A young British soldier, no more than 19, approached the fence slowly, his hands visibly empty and raised slightly in a gesture of peace. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke in halting, heavily accented Japanese, clearly memorized phrases taught for exactly this kind of interaction. We, no hurt. We, help rebuild. War, finished. Peace now. His pronunciation was atrocious, his grammar broken, but the sincerity in his voice transcended language. He reached into his pack and pulled out chocolate bars, luxury items that had been standard issue for occupying troops specifically to share with civilians. He held them out toward the fence, toward the children who had begun to peek out from behind their mothers' kimonos. Mrs. Yamamoto moved to intercept, to knock the chocolate from his hands, but Hiroko gently caught her arm. Wait, she whispered. Just wait and watch. What happened next was a masterclass in nonverbal communication. The young soldier, seeing the old woman's hostility and Hiroko's restraint, did something extraordinary. He opened one of the chocolate bars, broke off a piece, and ate it himself, a universal gesture that said, "It's safe, it's not poisoned, it's just kindness." Then he smiled, that vulnerable smile of someone hoping desperately to bridge an impossible gap, and placed the chocolates on a fence post before stepping back. He didn't force interaction. He didn't demand gratitude. He simply offered and retreated, giving the Japanese families the dignity of choice. The silence returned, but now it was different. It was contemplative rather than shocked, processing rather than frozen. One of the children, a little boy no more than 5, broke free from his mother's grip and ran to the fence. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a chocolate bar and ran back. His mother gasped, expecting something terrible. But the soldier just laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh, and gave a small wave. The boy waved back. And in that exchange, witnessed by dozens of neighbors, the entire architecture of dehumanization began to crumble. Hiroko felt something breaking inside her, not painfully but like a dam that had held back too much for too long. She turned to Mrs. Yamamoto, whose face was now wet with tears of confusion and grief. "I know you've lost so much," Hiroko said gently. "I know the anger feels like the only way to honor that loss. But what if the way we honor our dead is not by continuing to hate, but by refusing to let the lies that sent them to die continue to poison the living?" Mrs. Yamamoto's expression cycled through anger, resistance, and then something that looked like exhaustion. "But if they're not monsters," she whispered, "then what was it all for? What did my son die fighting?" It was the question that haunted an entire nation in that moment. Hiroko had no easy answer, but she had truth. He died because leaders, on both sides, convinced young men that the other side was less than human. He died because of a lie. And the only way to make sure others don't die for the same lie is to refuse to believe it anymore, even when letting it go feels like betrayal. The words hung in the air, radical and uncomfortable and undeniably true. Over the following hours and days, something miraculous and painful and profoundly human unfolded in Yokohama and across Japan. The silence gave way to tentative interactions. The soldiers, under strict orders to be respectful, became a constant, unthreatening presence. They helped clear rubble. They shared rations when local supplies were scarce. They showed photographs of their homes, their families, their own losses. And slowly, agonizingly, the Japanese civilians began to see them not as categories but as individuals. The process was not smooth. There were incidents, misunderstandings, and legitimate grievances. The occupation was not without its problems and abuses. But in neighborhoods like Hiroko's, something fundamental had shifted. The human face had replaced the propaganda mask, and once that happened, there was no going back. Hiroko herself became an unexpected bridge. Her English, learned from those forbidden books, allowed her to translate not just words but intentions. She helped British officers understand local customs they might accidentally offend. She helped her neighbors navigate the complex emotions of receiving help from former enemies. She organized a community meeting where both Japanese civilians and British soldiers sat in the same room, an event that began in tense silence but ended with shared tea and halting conversations about children, gardens, and hopes for the future. Mrs. Yamamoto attended that meeting. She didn't speak to any soldiers, but she stayed. And that act of staying, of not walking out, was its own form of courage and transformation. The climax of this quiet revolution came 6 weeks into the occupation. At a community memorial service for all who had died in the war, Japanese and Allied, soldiers and civilians. The idea had been Hiroko's, proposed tentatively to both community leaders and British command. Many resisted. "How can we mourn our enemies?" asked traditional voices. "How can we mourn with those who killed our people?" But Hiroko persisted with a simple question. When does the war actually end? When the papers are signed? Or when we stop seeing each other as enemies? The service took place at a local Buddhist temple that had survived the bombing. Japanese families brought photographs of their lost loved ones. British soldiers attended in dress uniforms, many bringing flowers. There were no speeches, no attempts to explain or justify. There was simply silence, shared grief, and the revolutionary acknowledgement that loss is loss, regardless of which flag a person died under. During that service, something profound happened that few witnessed but many heard about. Mrs. Yamamoto, carrying a photograph of her son in his naval uniform, came face to face with the young British soldier who had offered chocolate that first day. They stood before each other, an elderly Japanese mother and a teenage British private, separated by everything except their shared humanity. The soldier saw the photograph, recognized it for what it was, and without hesitation he saluted. A crisp, respectful military salute to a fallen enemy soldier. Mrs. Yamamoto's legs almost gave out. Hiroko, standing nearby, rushed to support her. "Why?" Mrs. Yamamoto whispered in Japanese, which Hiroko translated. "Why honor him? He fought against you." The young soldier's response, delivered through Hiroko's translation, would be repeated throughout the neighborhood for years to come. Because he was brave. Because he believed in something. Because he was someone's son, just like I am. And because the only way forward is if we honor what was human about all of it, even when everything else was inhuman. Mrs. Yamamoto wept then. Not with rage, but with the kind of grief that comes when long-held anger finally has permission to transform into something else. She bowed deeply to the young soldier. The formal bow of respect, not submission. He returned it with equal gravity. And in that exchange, witnessed by dozens of families from both sides, the possibility of genuine peace became tangible. It wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't about excusing. It was about recognizing shared humanity even across the chasm of terrible history. This was the true turning point, not in policy or politics, but in the human heart's capacity to hold both grief and grace simultaneously. In the weeks and months that followed, Hiroko's neighborhood became something of a model for successful reconciliation. She started English classes where Japanese women and British soldiers learned from each other. Not just language, but culture, history, perspective. She created spaces for difficult conversations where people could express their anger, their loss, their confusion, without judgment. She helped families navigate the complex process of requesting information about relatives who had died in Allied custody, and assisted British command in understanding local sensitivities. She became, without seeking the title, a bridge between worlds that had spent years trying to destroy each other. Her late father's books, those smuggled volumes of Western literature, came out of hiding and were shared freely, becoming tools for understanding that the other had always been human, creative, capable of beauty and wisdom. The library he had quietly built became a community resource, a testament to the power of curiosity over propaganda. Mrs. Yamamoto underwent her own transformation. She began attending Hiroko's English classes, sitting in the back, never speaking but always listening. 3 months after that first silent encounter, she invited the young British soldier to her home for tea, an event that shocked the neighborhood. She showed him her son's letters from the front, his childhood drawings, the small shrine she kept in his honor. Through Hiroko's translation, she told him stories about her son's life, not his death. And the soldier shared his own fear of dying so far from home, his relief at surviving, his guilt about feeling that relief. They didn't become friends exactly. The wounds were too deep for that. But they became something perhaps more important, mutual witnesses to each other's humanity. When the soldier's unit was transferred to another region, he left Mrs. Yamamoto a photograph of himself with his mother, and a letter that Hiroko translated. "I will remember your son. I will tell people about his courage. And I will work to make sure the world my children inherit is one where mothers don't have to lose their sons to lies about enemies who were never really enemies at all." The message that emerged from this quiet, profound transformation in a small neighborhood in Yokohama rippled far beyond its immediate context. Hiroko, asked to speak at a regional gathering of community leaders, said something that would be quoted for generations. "We were taught that seeing the enemy as human was weakness. But I learned that seeing the enemy as human, even when they've caused terrible harm, even when the grief is still fresh, is perhaps the strongest thing we can do. Because it means choosing truth over comfortable lies, choosing the difficult path of understanding over the easy path of continued hatred. The war didn't end when the bombs stopped, or the papers were signed. The war ended in each of our hearts when we chose to see faces instead of monsters, when we chose to remember that every uniform contains a person with a story, a mother who loves them, dreams that were interrupted by history's violence." This story asks us to consider some uncomfortable questions. How many of our certainties are actually propaganda we've internalized? How often do we reduce other people to categories, political, religious, national, rather than recognizing their full humanity? What would it cost us to acknowledge that those we've been taught to fear or hate are, at their core, as human and as complicated as we are? The women of Japan who stood in silence that September day in 1945 faced the collapse of a narrative that had defined their reality. Many of us carry our own versions of that narrative, not about Allied soldiers, but about immigrants, about people of different faiths, about those on the other side of our political divides. We are told who to fear, who to distrust, who to see as less than fully human, and we believe it because it's simpler than the messy, uncomfortable truth that humanity is the one characteristic that transcends all our divisions. The lesson of Hiroko and Mrs. Yamamoto is not that all conflicts are misunderstandings, or that there's no such thing as genuine evil, or that we should naively trust everyone. The lesson is that our first instinct should be to see the human, to question the narrative that makes dehumanization easy, to resist the propaganda that turns people into categories. It's about understanding that peace doesn't begin with governments signing treaties. It begins with individuals choosing to see beyond what they've been told to see, to feel empathy even when empathy has been labeled as betrayal, to hold space for complexity in a world that demands simplistic divisions. What happened in Japan after the war was not a simple story of conqueror and conquered. It was a story of millions of individual moments where people chose understanding over hatred, where they allowed their certainties to be challenged by reality, where they transformed their grief into bridges instead of walls. It was painful. It was slow. It was incomplete. There are Japanese families who, understandably, never forgave, who never could reconcile, and their feelings are valid too. But for those who found the courage to see their former enemies as human beings, the transformation was profound and lasting. Japan and Britain, Japan and America, nations that had poured everything into destroying each other became allies, partners, even friends, not because of political expediency, but because enough individuals made the daily choice to see humanity in the face they'd been taught to hate. So here's what I want you to take from this story. The next time you find yourself absolutely certain about someone based on their category, their politics, their religion, their nationality, their identity, pause. Ask yourself, am I seeing a person or am I seeing propaganda? Am I responding to who they actually are, or to what I've been told they are? That pause, that question is where peace begins. That's where the cycle of dehumanization breaks. That's where you become like Hiroko, choosing the difficult truth over the comfortable lie, choosing to see the human face even when everything in your culture tells you to see a monster. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you reconsider even one assumption about people you've been taught to fear or dismiss, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that challenge us to see the world with clearer, more compassionate eyes. Drop a comment about a time when you discovered that someone you were taught to fear or distrust turned out to be simply powerfully human. Let's create a community that chooses understanding over division, that sees faces instead of categories, that builds bridges instead of walls, Because the war, whatever war we're talking about, ends when we choose to see each other, really see each other. And that choice is available to every one of us, every single day.